We use 21, 22 million barrels of oil a day in our country. We use 70% of that in transportation for liquid fuels. What we have been doing for 150 years now is harvesting what nature has stored away in the ancient past over a very long time period. And we are now mining that resource very, very quickly. The National Academy of Sciences has said that if we turned all of our corn into ethanol, every bit of it, and discounted it for fossil fuel input, which is very high, at least 80%, that it would displace 2.4% of our gasoline. They noted that we could save as much gasoline by tuning up our cars and putting air in the tires. And that's all of our corn crop. The relatively trifling contribution that corn ethanol has made has doubled the price of corn. Farmers have diverted land from soybeans and wheat to corn, so soybeans and wheat prices have gone up. Drought in rice-producing areas around the world have driven the price of rice up. So we now have a food shortage worldwide and food riots in several countries. And our corn ethanol, at least, is partly responsible for that. Mr. Willie, you mentioned the difficulty in getting financing, which is the reason I'm a very strong proponent of ARPA-E. Much of the really cutting-edge technology in our military today is there because of DARPA. And what DARPA does is to fund technologies that are so out there that you can't ask your stockholders in your company to finance that. And that's a legitimate role of government. And so I'm a strong supporter of ARPA-E. It's now the law, but this administration is not supporting that. I hope we pass another law that punishes them if they don't support it. There are two bubbles that have broken, Mr. Chairman. The first was the hydrogen bubble, the hydrogen economy. It was supposed to solve all of our problems. I think people finally figured out that hydrogen is not an energy source. Hydrogen is simply a carrier of energy. Think of it as a battery, and you've got it right. And it will be very useful by and by when we have a economically supportable fuel cell, probably 2 decades off, because a fuel cell is at least twice as efficient as the reciprocating engine. And when you burn hydrogen, you get water. By the way, for those who tell you that they've got some new technique for getting energy out of water, they probably also believe they're going to get energy out of the ashes in their furnace. Because water is the oxide of hydrogen. Water is what you get when you burn hydrogen. There ain't no energy in water, thank you. But a lot of people believe there is. The second bubble that broke was the corn ethanol bubble. And the third bubble that will break is the cellulosic ethanol bubble. We will get something from cellulosic ethanol. But I, among other things, in a life of 82 years, have been a farmer. And it's hard for me to imagine that we're going to get a whole lot more from our waste land, not good enough to grow anything on, than we could get from all of our corn and all of our soybeans. And Mr. Barnwell, the General Accounting Office has said if we turn all of our soybeans into soy diesel, all of it, every bit of it, that would displace 2.9% of our diesel. Again, trifling. If we just took our trucks off the road, except for the last mile, and put that cargo on trains, trains are at least 5 times as efficient as trucks in hauling cargo. Aren't we straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel? And shouldn't we really be looking at the big picture? And we could drastically reduce our use of gasoline if we had HOV3 and HOV2. We could drastically reduce our use of diesel if we simply put that cargo in a train except for the last mile. And by the way, if you can move it by water, that's at least 5 times as efficient as moving it by train. So you need to move it by water as far as you can, and then by train, and trucks only the last mile. Mr. Tadaro, you mentioned algae. We're now exploiting algae, which grew, and it was probably algae that grew, you're right, probably these ancient subtropical seas. And by the way, our Earth was at one time very much warmer because we had subtropical seas in the North Slope and in the sea beds. They weren't sea beds then. The land was higher north of England. So what we're now trying to do is to exploit a technology which nature used over a very long time period, and then squirreled the product away in these gas and oil reserves. When you're looking at how much gasoline we will displace, I suspect that we're not really using energy profit ratio, that we're not discounting it for the fossil fuel input. And isn't it a little silly to pretend that you displaced gasoline, oil, when 80% of the energy that you get out of ethanol came from the fossil fuels that help grow the corn and produce the ethanol? Mr. Burns, you mentioned syngas. Would you tell us a little bit about the efficiencies of syngas as compared to cellulosic ethanol? With steam reforming, can't you take about any biomass and get syngas from it? And can't the chemist, starting with that hydrocarbon, make about anything he wishes from it, just as we do from oil today? And why isn't syngas a better place to start, which is a century-old technology? Why isn't that a better place to start than cellulosic ethanol, about which we know very little, and it's hugely challenging?
I'd be glad to respond, sir. I've often felt that one of the challenges to cellulose ethanol is getting the cellulose. You have a kind of a gold rush of cellulose at the end of the growing season, and you've got to get it to the plant and preserve it and keep it in a certain condition to undergo a fermentative process. I think with gasification, burn it. It'll burn any time of the year, whenever it's available, and I think there's a wider variety of feedstocks available from trash, all kinds of things, whether old or new carbon. They're going somewhere. I think it is something to consider and I think gasification in the reforming process, through an adjustment of catalyst and pressure and temperature, you could make any carbon length chain that you want, from 2-carbon ethanol to 4-carb butanol to 16-carbon diesel or whatever you need, and almost with a dial. With these kinds of inputs going in, that's a solid technology. I am uncertain what the efficiency is, the energy efficiency is. I know in a gasification process, the energy input is a match, and then oxygen, and then waste heat is evolved in the process, which can be recovered for something else. But other than that, the energy, comes from the material itself. The ethanol facilities in Brazil they don't have a DDG feed. They burn that, and that biomass goes back to feed their ethanol process. Those BTUs go back to their ethanol production, so they have a different system there. But I don't see why we don't use that. I think in 1932, it was at its height, and it was replaced, with electricity that took its place in those, once Tesla figured out how to transport that. But no, I think that should be considered. I know there's a pilot plant going up in Germany. Corn Industries is doing that. I don't know that that's happening here, except on a very small scale.
Syngas is what? Hydrogen and carbon monoxide?
Yes, sir. Syngas is any carbonaceous material in an oxygen-starved environment, so it's C plus 1/2 O2 is H2 and CO.
Yeah.